Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we are going to be talking about the slave trade as it was in West Africa. Now I know this is not a very pretty subject to talk about, but it is one that is important to cover and to make sure that we understand what the slave trade was like in West Africa and how it ends up being very different from the slave trade that came to be in the Americas. Now, last time we were talking about other aspects of West Africa, like the kingdoms and their religion, but today we are going to get into slavery as it was in West Africa. As in other pre-modern societies, slavery was common in West Africa. In fact, human beings were frequently used as items of trade, along with gold, salt, ivory, and other valuable resources found in the region. West African rulers sold about 1,000 slaves annually to Arab traders who carried them in caravans across the Sahara to the Mediterranean. So, the slave trade in West Africa did exist. It is what it was one of the major things that they traded from West Africa, and like I said earlier, it is very different in how it was used and practiced in comparison to the system that came to be in the Americas. Slavery was a common fate for people who were conquered or captured during warfare. So people who became prisoners of war or were captured during combat or during war were often became slaves. That was often their fate. It was that or dying, so that was often what came of them. People who committed crimes or were otherwise found undesirable to the community might also be enslaved. If you were a person who committed a terrible crime in West Africa, slavery was a common punishment that would be enforced upon people who were found guilty of crimes. African slavery was certainly brutal in many ways. Individual slaves were often mistreated and some even died. So, I am going to talk about the ways that slavery is different in West Africa as compared to how it came to be in the Americas, but I am by no means saying that it was a pleasant experience for anyone. So, to continue on, in general, however, African slavery differed from the system that would eventually develop in the Americas. In Africa, slaves were usually adopted by the families into which they were sold. They could also marry, and, as a rule, their children did not inherit the status of slaves. That is different from the system that came to be in the Americas. In the Americas, if you were born the child of a slave, you were born a slave. From the moment that you drew your first breath as a little tiny baby, you were a slave. That was the system in the Americas. In West Africa, if your mother or father was a slave and you were born a free person. You were not a slave. Your parents were slaves, or one of them was a slave, but you yourself were not a slave upon birth. But in the Americas, they were. Also, in the Americas, slaves were not adopted into the families to which they were sold, and they could not marry. Whenever slaves were sold in the Americas, if there was a man and woman who were married, the traders did not care. It was a very common thing for married couples to be split up and to never see each other again. They would be sold into different families and they would just never see each other again. But in West Africa, slaves were usually, not always, but usually adopted by the families, and they could marry, and as it says there, their children were not inherently slaves upon their birth. Although dependent upon the king, meaning depending on what kingdom they lived in, Successful slave commanders and officials could become wealthy from the rewards of their positions. So slaves were paid in Africa, sometimes, not always. But there are records that show that there were people who were slaves, but they were paid and actually became wealthy from their position. But most importantly, slavery in West Africa was not based on the notion of racial superiority or inferiority. Now, the system of slavery that came to be in the Americas was based on this notion that because the difference in race, one was considered superior to the others. But that is a uniquely American view of slavery. The slave trade as it was in West Africa was not based on racial superiority or inferiority, but in the Americas it was. That is an important differentiation to make. As you'll notice in the slide here, I have bolded and highlighted the word not. So, hint hint, that's probably something you should know for the quiz on Friday. Okay, so let's start talking about some of the European powers that we are going to see come into play here. Portugal explores West Africa. Located on the Atlantic Ocean and close to Africa, the country of Portugal was ideally situated to seek new trade routes. Using new navigational tools such as the compass and the astrolabe, the Portuguese ventured into the Atlantic Ocean and explored the coast of West Africa beginning in the 1400s. Now, this picture here, as you can see my mouse cursor, this second picture here, this is a picture of an astrolabe. By looking down the sight of an astrolabe and aiming it at a star and orienting it based on the horizon, sailors could use that measurement to determine where they were. Now, I do not know how to use an astrolabe myself. I would be very interested to learn how to use one. I think that would be kind of a cool thing to kind of play around with and learn about, but I do not know how to use them, but I know that that is what they were used for. It was for navigation and a way to keep your place. You know, the sailors didn't have GPS or Google Maps back in the day, so they had to rely on tools like this and just looking at the stars. When the Portuguese first sailed along the coast of Africa, they were largely interested in gold, and this is going to be a common recurring thing that you're going to see over and over. Looking for gold, the quest for gold. That is what a lot of people are going to be exploring and looking for. They exported a variety of goods including peppers, ivory, copper, and African slaves. Europeans in the mid-1400s first became involved in the long-standing slave trade of Africa. So, with the African kingdoms exporting slaves, the European traders were buying them and then selling them back in Europe and eventually in the Americas. Commercial treaties permitted the Portuguese to construct fortified trading posts at key harbors along the coast. The forts served to keep away rival European vessels. The Portuguese treated rivals harshly, confiscating their vessels and casting their crews into the ocean to drown. So they were not fooling around. The original Portuguese sailors and traders, if they got to an African port first and was able to get permission to build a fortification there, they would defend it. And if there was a ship came from another European country that they were rivals with, they would sink the ship and go on board and kill everyone, take all of their cargo and kill the sailors. This was a pretty hardcore thing. The Portuguese did not invent the slave trade, but they did greatly expand it. By 1500, Europeans purchased about 1,800 African slaves a year. This nearly doubled the previous trade of some 1,000 slaves between Arab traders and the West African rulers. So, like I said, the Europeans did not invent this slave trade, but they did greatly expand it. They brought a lot more buyers and sellers to the trade, and really expanded the slave trade. This map that I have here, you can see all of the different trade routes that the ships followed and all of the different places they eventually took slaves to. So this was a massive, massive network eventually. You know, at first it was just a few ports, but it grew and grew and grew, and it became a major, major money maker for a lot of countries involved. Okay, growing numbers of slaves were sent across the Atlantic to labor on new plantations in the Americas. Here began the brutal exploitation of West Africans enslaved by Europeans, a fate that would befall millions more African men and women in the centuries ahead. So, in this picture that I have here on this slide, this is a drawing, it is a depiction of how slaves were packed into these trading ships. As you can see, not a whole lot of space. They are crammed side by side by side, and terrible conditions. Many slaves died on these ships, and if a slave died on the ship, they just throw him overboard. Didn't want him anymore. You know, they're just weighing the ship down, and they start to stink, throw them overboard. If they get sick, doesn't look like they're going to make it, throw them overboard. This was a brutal, brutal exploitation of human lives, and we will learn more about the slave trade in future chapters. So, okay, that's going to be it for this video. If you have any questions for me, have any comments or concerns, you can leave a comment on this video. You can send me a message on Schoology or an email. You guys know all the ways you can get a hold of me. I hope that I see you back in the classroom very soon. Thank you for getting online, for attending the classes, watching the videos, doing the work that you need to. I know remote learning is a real struggle for some people. I know that it is. And it's not my favorite thing in the world either. I would much rather be doing this in person with you guys, but this is the situation that we're in, and we just got to make the best of it. So, I hope everybody's having a great day, and I'll see you again real soon. Bye.